What if the barrier between reality and madness was not a wall, but a veil so thin that thought itself could tear through it? Beyond the boundaries of our material universe, past the edge of every star and the void between galaxies, there exists a dimension that defies every law of physics humanity has ever understood. It is not simply another place. It is the place where physics goes to die, where time becomes meaningless, where the very concept of space collapses into impossible geometries that would shatter a mortal mind upon observation. The Imperium of man calls it the Immaterium. The Eldar know it as the Sea of Souls, but most who have glimpsed its terrible majesty simply call it what it is, the realm of chaos. And within its churning depths, something looks back at us with a hunger that has consumed entire civilizations. Imagine standing on the shore of an ocean at midnight. The water before you is not made of molecules or matter, but of pure emotion given form. Every thought that has ever crossed the mind of every sentient being in the galaxy flows into this vast psychic sea. Joy becomes a ripple, rage becomes a wave, despair becomes a crushing current that could drag entire worlds beneath its surface. This is the fundamental nature of the warp, a mirror dimension where consciousness itself becomes the building blocks of reality. But mirrors can distort, they can warp. They can show you things that were never meant to exist. The ancient navigators of Terra, in those first tentative explorations beyond their solar system, discovered something that would forever change the course of human history. Faster-than-light travel through conventional space remained impossible, locked behind the insurmountable wall of Einstein's equations. But there was another way. If a ship could pierce the veil between dimensions and enter the Immaterium, it could traverse distances that would take millennia in real space within mere days or weeks. Space itself bent differently there. The journey from one side of the galaxy to another became achievable. Humanity reached for the stars and grasped them, never truly understanding the price of admission they had agreed to pay. Because the warp is not empty, it has never been empty. Since the first sentient thought echoed across the galaxy millions of years ago, the Immaterium has been accumulating the psychic residue of consciousness like sediment building at the bottom of an ocean. And from that sediment, things have taken shape. Entities of such vast power and alien intelligence that calling them gods barely scratches the surface of their true nature have coalesced from the collective unconscious of countless species. They are the ruinous powers, the dark gods of chaos, and each one embodies fundamental aspects of sentient existence, twisted into their most extreme and terrible forms. In the deepest reaches of the Immaterium, where the screaming winds of raw emotion reach velocities that could strip the soul from a living being in nanoseconds, there sits a throne of brass and blood. Upon it broods Khorne, the blood god, formed from every act of violence, every murder, every battlefield slaughter that has ever occurred. His realm is an endless wasteland of brass fortresses and mountains made of skulls. Rivers of blood flow through canyons carved by eternally warring demons. To enter his domain is to feel rage so pure and overwhelming that concepts like mercy and compassion burn away like paper in a furnace. Violence is not simply encouraged here. It is the only reality that exists. But Khorne is not alone in his dominion over the warp. In another corner of that impossible realm, in gardens that bloom with pestilence and beauty intertwined, Nurgle the Plague Father cultivates his grotesque paradise. He is entropy made manifest, the inevitable decay of all things given consciousness and terrible purpose. His love for his creations is genuine and suffocating. Every virus, every bacteria, every disease that has ever ravaged organic life flows from his generosity. Where Khorne offers the violent release of death, Nurgle offers something far worse: immortality through corruption, existence without end in a body that never stops rotting but never quite dies. Deeper still, in crystalline labyrinths that shift and change with every observation, Tzeentch, the architect of fate, weaves his incomprehensible schemes. He is ambition, hope, and knowledge corrupted into obsession. Every plot ever conceived, every conspiracy ever hatched, Every desperate grasp for power feeds his vast intellect. His realm is a library containing every possible future, every potential outcome of every choice ever made. But knowledge gained from Tzeentch comes at a price measured in sanity. Those who seek his gifts discover too late that change is not always growth, and transformation can mean losing everything that made you human. And in palaces of terrible beauty, where excess has been elevated to a religious principle, Slaanesh the Dark Prince holds court. Born from the psychic death scream of the Eldar civilization, this youngest of the Chaos Gods embodies sensation pushed beyond all limits. Pleasure and pain merged into a single overwhelming experience. To enter Slaanesh's domain is to want, to crave, to need with an intensity that makes ordinary desire seem like pale imitation. Every addiction, every obsession, every moment where sensation mattered more than consequence feeds this entity's insatiable appetite. These four great powers carve up the Immaterium between them, their domains bleeding into one another in ways that defy mapping. But between their territories, in the churning sea of souls itself, smaller entities swim through the psychic currents. Demons beyond counting, each one a fragment of their patron god's essence, hunt for any weakness in the barrier between dimensions. They press against the veil constantly, searching for the places where real space grows thin, where a careless thought or a moment of extreme emotion might create a tear large enough to slip through. The Imperium maintains the Astronomicon, a psychic lighthouse powered by the sacrifice of thousands of souls daily, specifically to help ships navigate the treacherous currents of the warp. Without it, human vessels would become lost in that dimension, their crews driven mad by the whispers of demons, or simply translated into regions of space far from their intended destination. Time flows differently in the Immaterium. A voyage that takes weeks for the travelers might see centuries pass in real space, or vice versa. Ships have emerged from warp travel before they entered it. Crews have aged backwards. Some vessels arrive at their destinations with everyone aboard already dead, from causes that will not occur for another 1,000 years. The greatest mystery of the warp, however, is not the Chaos Gods themselves or their demon servants. It is the question of the barrier. What maintains the separation between the Immaterium and real space? Why has that veil not torn completely, allowing the full force of chaos to flood into our dimension? The answer lies in the nature of consciousness itself, in the delicate balance between thought and reality. But that balance grows more precarious with every passing century. The Cicatrix Maledictum, the great rift that now splits the galaxy in two, proves that the barrier is not as permanent as humanity once believed. Something is changing in the warp. The Chaos Gods grow stronger with each conflict, each plague, each desperate soul that cries out into the void. Their domains expand. Their influence deepens. And in the spaces between their territories, in the churning depths where even demons fear to swim, there are whispers of something else stirring. Something that predates even the ruinous powers themselves. Something that watched the birth of the first Chaos God and will still be watching when the last star burns out. The realm of chaos is not simply a dimension of madness and corruption. It is a reflection of us, of every choice we make, every emotion we feel, every thought we think. And that reflection is becoming clearer. Every human being who has ever lived carries within them a spark of presence in the warp. The ancient scholars called it the soul, that indefinable essence that separates consciousness from mere biological computation. When you think, when you feel, when you dream in the depths of sleep, that spark flares brighter in the Immaterium, creating ripples that spread across its impossible surface. Most humans possess such weak psychic signatures that their individual impact on the warp barely registers, like single raindrops falling into an infinite ocean. But collectively, the trillions upon trillions of souls across the galaxy create currents powerful enough to birth gods. This is the terrible truth that the Imperium has spent 10,000 years trying to suppress. We are not victims of chaos. We are its architects. The Navigators understand this better than most. Born into ancient houses that trace their lineages back to the Age of Strife, these mutants possess a third eye hidden behind ornate seals and elaborate veils. When opened, this warp eye allows them to perceive the currents of the Immaterium directly, to see the howling tides of emotion and madness as clearly as ordinary humans see physical space. They guide the Imperium's vessels through that dimension, steering between the predatory entities that hunt in its depths, avoiding the worst of the psychic storms that can trap a ship for eternity. But every journey extracts a price. The Navigators see things in the warp that cannot be unseen, witness horrors that etch themselves into memory with the permanence of acid on metal. Many go mad. More simply vanish during transit, their consciousness consumed by something that noticed their presence and reached out to claim it. The act of warp travel itself represents humanity's greatest hubris and its most desperate necessity. When a ship activates its Gellar Field and transitions into the Immaterium, it carries with it a bubble of real space physics, a pocket of normal reality surrounded by the howling madness of chaos. Inside this protective envelope, time passes normally, gravity functions as expected, and the laws of thermodynamics remain intact. But the field is not perfect. It flickers, sometimes for mere nanoseconds, sometimes for longer. In those moments when the barrier weakens, the warp bleeds through. Shadows move in corridors where no physical object stands. Voices whisper from the walls, speaking in languages that predate human civilization. Crew members see things in the corners of their vision, fleeting impressions of entities that should not exist pressing themselves against the invisible boundary that separates protection from damnation. The worst incidents occur when a Gellar Field fails completely during transit. The ship remains physically intact, suspended in that dimension where physics holds no sway. But everything living inside becomes exposed to the raw essence of the warp. Time ceases to flow in linear fashion. The crew experiences every moment of their lives simultaneously. Past and future collapsed into an eternal present. Demons pour through the walls like water through paper, claiming souls with the casual ease of a child plucking flowers. Sometimes these vessels emerge back into real space weeks or months later, drifting ghost ships where every surface is covered in symbology written in blood, where the crew has long since been transformed into things that beg for death but cannot remember how to die. The Imperium destroys such vessels on sight, burning them to atoms with concentrated lance fire, but not before boarding parties equipped with the heaviest psychic wards attempt to retrieve the ship's logs. Knowledge, even terrible knowledge, has value to those who fight an eternal war against chaos. The Eldar know this better than humanity ever could. Their civilization stood at its zenith when mankind still huddled in caves, painting primitive images on stone walls. They had mastered the webway, an artificial network of tunnels through the warp that allowed instantaneous travel without exposure to its dangers. They had pushed art, science, and philosophy to heights that made them seem as gods to lesser species. And in their arrogance, they forgot the fundamental rule of the Immaterium: every action creates a reaction. Every extreme of emotion feeds something in that mirror dimension. For millennia, the Eldar indulged every sensation, every desire, every dark curiosity their ancient culture had once kept restrained. They built entire worlds dedicated to pleasure, to the pursuit of experience without limit or consequence. And in the warp, something began to coalesce from their collective psychic emanations. The birth of Slaanesh was not a gradual awakening, but a cataclysmic explosion that tore a wound in reality itself. In a single terrible moment, the fourth Chaos God came into existence fully formed, gorged on the souls of an entire species. The psychic scream killed trillions of Eldar instantaneously, their souls ripped from their bodies and consumed by the newborn deity. The center of the Eldar Empire became a permanent wound in space-time, a region where the warp and real space merged completely. Humans would later call this region the Eye of Terror, a massive warp storm that has endured for 10,000 years without diminishing. Within its boundaries, demon worlds spin in impossible orbits around stars that burn with the stolen souls of the dead. Time flows backwards and forwards simultaneously. Entire civilizations of corrupted humans worship the ruinous powers openly, building monuments to chaos that would drive a sane person to madness merely by observation. But the Eye of Terror, vast as it is, represents only one of countless tears in the fabric of reality. Smaller warp storms dot the galaxy like infected wounds on flesh, appearing and disappearing according to patterns that the Imperium's most brilliant minds cannot predict. Some last for hours before the veil repairs itself. Others endure for centuries, cutting off entire sectors from communication and rendering them isolated in the darkness between stars. The Great Rift that now bisects the galaxy represents something far worse, a permanent expansion of the warp's influence into real space on a scale that threatens to divide the Imperium forever. On one side, Terra and the light of the Astronomicon remain visible. On the other, in the regions the Imperium now calls the Dark Imperium, the psychic lighthouse gutters and fades, visible only as a dim suggestion of direction rather than a clear beacon. Warp travel in those regions has become exponentially more dangerous. Ships emerge decades late from journeys that should have taken weeks. Others simply never arrive at all, lost somewhere in the swirling madness between dimensions. The question that haunts the Imperium's scholars and the Inquisition's most learned members is whether the expansion of chaos can be stopped or if it represents an inevitable conclusion to the universe's natural progression. The Chaos Gods themselves offer no answers, though their demon servants whisper hints and half-truths to those foolish enough to listen. Some among humanity's most radical thinkers have proposed theories so dangerous that merely speaking them aloud constitutes heresy worthy of execution. What if the Chaos Gods are not external threats, but natural phenomena, as inevitable as gravity or entropy? What if consciousness itself naturally produces these entities in any universe where sentient thought exists? What if the only way to defeat chaos is to eliminate the very thing that makes us human? Our ability to think, to feel, to choose. The Emperor of Mankind, entombed upon the Golden Throne for 10,000 years, offers no guidance on these questions. His psychic might holds the Astronomicon steady, but whether any consciousness remains within that decaying body, or if he simply persists as a vast psychic engine running on the souls fed to him daily, remains one of the Imperium's greatest mysteries. Some among the Inquisition believe the Emperor has transcended physical existence entirely, that his consciousness now battles the Chaos Gods directly within the warp itself, holding back their full power through sheer will alone. Others whisper darker theories, that the Emperor has himself begun to coalesce into a fifth Chaos God, that the worship of trillions of humans across the galaxy for 10 millennia has created something in the warp that mirrors the ruinous powers in all but name. In the depths of the Immaterium, beyond even the domains claimed by the four great powers, there exists a region that defies all attempts at understanding. The Navigators who have glimpsed it speak of a darkness so absolute that it seems to consume even the psychic light around it. A void within a void where the warp itself appears to recoil. No demon ventures near it. No chaos God claims dominion over it. Ancient texts recovered from pre-imperial civilizations reference this place in fragmentary passages, calling it by names that translate roughly to the place before beginnings, or the womb of absence. Some scholars theorize it represents the warp, as it existed before consciousness began shaping it, a pristine void untainted by thought or emotion. Others believe something sleeps there, something so vast and ancient that even the Chaos Gods are merely its dreams, and that its awakening would render every current conflict in the galaxy utterly meaningless. But perhaps the most disturbing revelation about the nature of the warp comes not from ancient text or navigator testimony, but from careful observation of its growth patterns. The Chaos Gods have not existed since the beginning of time. Khorne arose during the Middle Ages of Terra, fed by an age of unprecedented warfare and bloodshed. Nurgle coalesced during the Black Death, when plague ravaged the population of Old Earth. Tzeentch emerged from the scheming and ambition of countless civilizations, reaching for knowledge beyond their grasp. And Slaanesh, youngest of all, was born from the Eldar's fall a mere 10,000 years ago. The pattern suggests a terrible truth. The Chaos Gods are not static entities but growing, evolving consciousness that becomes stronger with each passing century. They learn. They adapt. They plan with timescales that span millennia. And if they continue to grow unchecked, if they continue to feed on the emotions and thoughts of every sentient being in the galaxy, then eventually they will become powerful enough to tear down the barrier between dimensions entirely, flooding real space with the full force of the Immaterium's madness. The Imperium stands at a precipice. Behind it lies 10,000 years of stagnation and decline, of technology slowly forgotten and knowledge gradually lost. Before it looms the abyss of chaos, growing deeper and more terrible with each passing moment. And in the warp itself, the reflection of humanity grows clearer, more defined, more solid. Soon, perhaps sooner than anyone realizes, that reflection will reach through the mirror and grasp at reality with fingers made of pure thought. When that moment comes, when the barrier finally shatters completely, the question will not be whether humanity can survive. The question will be whether anything will remain of the species that reached for the stars so long ago, or if they will have transformed entirely into something else, something that would be unrecognizable to their distant ancestors who first looked up at the night sky and wondered what lay beyond. There are those who have walked between the worlds and returned, though whether they returned whole is a matter of perspective. The Inquisition maintains records of these individuals locked in vaults so secure that the locations are known only to the High Lords themselves. Psychers who somehow survived prolonged exposure to the raw warp without Gellar Field protection. Navigators who claim to have communicated with entities in the Immaterium that were neither demons nor manifestations of the Chaos Gods. Rogue traders whose ships vanished for centuries only to reappear with crews who had not aged a single day, but whose eyes held the weight of millennia. Their testimonies, extracted through psychic interrogation and verified through methods that leave the subjects mentally scarred but truthful, paint a picture of the warp that contradicts everything the Imperium teaches its citizens. One such testimony comes from a navigator named Illara Vex, who guided her vessel through what should have been a routine transit from Ultramar to the Segmentum Solar. 6 weeks into the journey, her Gellar Field began experiencing fluctuations that the ship's tech priests could not explain. The field did not fail completely, but rather pulsed, creating moments where the barrier between dimensions thinned to the width of a thought. During these fluctuations, Illara reported seeing structures in the warp that should not exist. Not the brass fortresses of Khorne or the plague gardens of Nurgle, but architecture that predated those entities entirely. Vast geometric constructs that hurt to perceive, built according to mathematical principles that seemed to exist outside the normal framework of reality. When she attempted to look away, she found her third eye drawn inexorably back to these impossible buildings, as if they demanded observation, required witness. The structures were not empty. Through the flickering barrier of her Gellar Field, Illara watched figures moving within them, entities that appeared humanoid but wrong in ways she struggled to articulate during her interrogation. They moved through multiple dimensions simultaneously, their bodies occupying spaces that physics insisted could not hold physical form. And they were building something. With tools that seemed to phase in and out of existence, they manipulated raw warp energy as casually as a mason-shaped stone, constructing additions to their impossible architecture. When one of these entities noticed Illara observing, it stopped its work and turned toward her. In that moment of direct attention, she felt her consciousness expand beyond the confines of her skull, stretched across light years of real space and depths of the warp that no human should comprehend. The entity showed her something, though whether it was a vision or a memory or simply madness given form, even the inquisitors who interrogated her could not determine. She saw the warp as it existed before the first sentient thought echoed across the galaxy. A vast ocean of potential energy, perfectly calm, unmarked by consciousness. Then came the first spark. Some primitive creature on some forgotten world achieved the threshold of self-awareness, that critical moment when perception becomes reflection, when it becomes I. That single thought created the first ripple in the Immaterium, so small as to be nearly imperceptible. But it was enough. Like the first crack in a dam, it changed everything that followed. As life spread across the galaxy, as consciousness bloomed on a million worlds, the ripples multiplied. The calm ocean became choppy, then turbulent, then violent. And from that violence, the first entities began to coalesce. Not the chaos gods, not yet, but simpler things. Demons of hunger and fear, creatures of pure instinct given form by the collective unconsciousness of species that barely understood their own existence. These primitive demons were not malevolent in any meaningful sense. They simply were manifestations of base emotions without complex thought or purpose beyond their nature. A demon of hunger existed only to consume. A demon of fear existed only to be feared. They represented the warp learning the grammar of consciousness, early rough drafts of what would eventually become the elaborate horrors that now dominate the Immaterium. But something else lurked in those early visions, something that Alara only glimpsed in the spaces between her own perception. The entities building those impossible structures in the deep warp were not demons. They were older than demons, present in the Immaterium before the first conscious thought should have given rise to anything. And if they existed before consciousness shaped the warp, then what were they? What is their purpose in constructing architecture in a dimension where space itself is a fluid concept? The Inquisition classified Alara's testimony at the highest level and subjected her to extensive psychic screening to ensure she had not been corrupted during her observation. When the screening confirmed she remained untainted, they made a decision that spoke to how deeply her vision disturbed them. They did not execute her as would be standard procedure for someone exposed to forbidden knowledge. Instead, they assigned her to a specific duty. For the remainder of her life, Ilara Vex would guide ships along the most dangerous routes through the warp, routes that passed near the deepest regions where the Chaos Gods rarely extended their influence. She was instructed to watch, to observe, and to report any further sightings of the Builders or their impossible constructs. The Inquisition wanted to know if what she saw was unique, or if something vast and ancient was indeed at work in the foundations of the Immaterium itself. Alara was not the only one assigned to this secret watch. Across the Imperium, in sectors so distant from one another that communication between them could take years even with the swiftest astropathic messages, other navigators reported similar sightings. The descriptions varied in details but shared common elements. Geometric structures that defied conventional understanding. Entities that appeared to be working towards some incomprehensible goal. And most disturbing of all, the sense that these beings were aware of their observers, that they wanted to be seen. Some among the Inquisition began to propose a theory so radical that even speaking it within the halls of Terra constituted a risk. What if the Chaos Gods, terrible as they are, represent only the surface layer of the warp's true nature? What if beneath the domains of the ruinous powers, there exists an older stratum of reality where entities pursue agendas that have nothing to do with the corruption of humanity or the endless game of souls? This theory gained unexpected support from an unlikely source. Deep within the Black Library, that mystical repository of forbidden knowledge maintained by the Eldar, there exists a section that even the most learned Farseers fear to enter. The texts contained within this section were not written by Eldar hands, but recovered from civilizations that rose and fell millions of years before the Eldar themselves evolved sentience. These pre-Eldar species left behind fragmentary records that survived their extinction, encoded in materials that resist the decay of time through means unknown to current science. The few passages that have been translated speak of the warp, not as a dimension that sentient beings inadvertently created through their thoughts, but as a dimension that existed before the physical universe itself, a realm that gave birth to real space rather than the other way around. If this is true, If the Immaterium represents not a reflection of our reality, but the foundation from which our reality emerged, then every assumption about the relationship between chaos and the material universe collapses. The chaos gods would not be parasites feeding on consciousness, but rather natural inhabitants of their native dimension, perhaps even the architects of physical reality itself. Humanity's entry into the warp through faster-than-light travel would not be an invasion of hostile territory, but a return to something like a point of origin. And the corruption that chaos brings would not be an outside force destroying order, but rather the original state of existence, reasserting itself over the artificial construct of physical law. This interpretation explains certain mysteries that have long puzzled the Imperium scholars. Why does the warp respond to consciousness if consciousness did not create it? Why do the chaos gods exhibit behaviors that suggest purpose and intent beyond simple reaction to mortal emotion? Why do certain regions of the Immaterium seem to exist independently of any emotional resonance from real space, maintaining their form and structure regardless of what sentient beings think or feel? If the warp predates real space, then it possessed its own native physics, its own rules and principles that operated before the laws of thermodynamics or causality came into being. The chaos gods might not be corruptions of order, but rather examples of what order looks like in a dimension where thought creates reality directly. The implications of this understanding are staggering. If consciousness does not create the warp, but rather emerges from it, then every soul that exists in real space represents a fragment of the Immaterium temporarily housed in physical form. Birth would not be the creation of a new consciousness, but the manifestation of something that already existed in the warp, choosing or being forced to inhabit material reality. Death would not be the end, but simply a return to the native dimension, the soul shedding its physical shell and re-entering the sea from which it came. This explains why the chaos gods hunger so desperately for mortal souls. They are not consuming foreign entities, but reclaiming what was always theirs, gathering back the fragments of the Immaterium that temporarily experienced existence as separate individuals. Humanity stands revealed not as victims of chaos, but as exiles from it, consciousness that somehow became trapped in the cage of physical law, desperately maintaining the fiction of materiality against the tide of the warp that seeks to reclaim what it has lost. Every Gellar Field represents not protection, but imprisonment, a bubble of artificial reality held against the press of the true nature of existence. Every navigator who guides ships through the Immaterium feels the pull not of destruction, but of home. The deep recognition that the howling madness of the warp is somehow more real, more fundamentally true, than the ordered universe of stars and planets and physical bodies. And in this context, the Emperor's great work takes on a darker shade of meaning. His Webway project, his attempts to create artificial tunnels through the warp that would allow humanity to traverse that dimension without exposure to its influence, was not salvation, but the ultimate act of rebellion against the natural order. He sought to make humanity independent of the Immaterium, to sever the connection between consciousness and its source. When Magnus the Red broke through the psychic wards protecting the Webway project, when demons poured through the breach and forced the Emperor to abandon his great work, it was not catastrophe, but correction. The warp refusing to be denied what belongs to it. But there exists another interpretation, one whispered only in the most secure chambers of the Inquisition's Ordo Malleus, where the demon hunters gather to share intelligence too dangerous for wider dissemination. This theory proposes that the relationship between the warp and real space represents not a hierarchy but a war, an eternal struggle between two fundamentally incompatible states of existence. Physical reality, with its laws and constants and predictable cause and effect relationships, did not emerge peacefully from the Immaterium but tore itself free in an act of cosmic rebellion. The universe as we understand it exists because it successfully separated from the warp, establishing boundaries and rules that the chaotic nature of the Immaterium could not penetrate. But separation is not the same as independence. The barrier between dimensions grows thinner with each passing millennium, and the warp presses ever harder against it, seeking to reclaim what was severed, to dissolve the artificial order of physics back into the primordial chaos from which it escaped. In this interpretation, consciousness becomes the battleground. Every sentient being exists simultaneously in both realms, their physical bodies anchored in real space while their souls extend into the Immaterium like roots reaching down into dark soil. The Chaos Gods do not create corruption through external influence, but rather through awakening, reminding each soul of its connection to the warp, calling it back to a state of existence where individual identity dissolves into the vast collective unconsciousness. Khorne does not make men violent. He reminds them that violence is the fundamental truth beneath the veneer of civilization. Nurgle does not spread disease. He reveals that decay is not the opposite of life, but its inevitable conclusion and continuation. Tzeentch does not cause schemes to fail. He demonstrates that change is the only constant and that all plans ultimately serve purposes beyond mortal comprehension. Slaanesh does not corrupt through pleasure. The Dark Prince shows that sensation is more real than the physical world that generates it, that consciousness values experience over survival, that given the choice between existence and ecstasy, the soul will always choose the latter. The Space Marines who fall to chaos, those transhuman warriors who were specifically engineered to resist the warp's influence, do not fall because they are weak. They fall because they see too clearly. The traitor legions who turned against the Emperor during the Horus Heresy did not betray him out of simple ambition or wounded pride. They recognized a fundamental truth that the Imperium has spent 10,000 years trying to suppress. The Emperor's vision for humanity, a species free from the taint of chaos and capable of existing purely within the rational confines of physical law, is not salvation but extinction. To completely sever humanity from the warp would be to strip away everything that makes consciousness meaningful. Without connection to the Immaterium, humans would become automatons, biological machines executing programmed responses without genuine thought or emotion. The price of freedom from chaos is the loss of humanity itself. This realization has driven entire chapters of Space Marines into the embrace of the ruinous powers. The word-bearers who once sought divine truth with zealous devotion found it not in the Emperor but in chaos. Their Primarch, Lorgar, understood before any of his brothers that the warp represented not damnation but liberation, the only true divinity in a universe built on lies. The Emperor had insisted he was not a god while simultaneously demanding worship through his actions. He claimed to champion truth while hiding the fundamental nature of reality from his own sons. When Lorgar finally opened his eyes to the genuine powers that existed beyond the veil, he did not see monsters. He saw honesty. The Chaos Gods do not pretend to be benevolent. They do not mask their nature behind noble rhetoric or false promises of a better future. They are exactly what they appear to be, and in a universe built on deception, that naked authenticity holds a terrible appeal. The Thousand Sons followed a different path to the same conclusion. Their Primarch, Magnus, was perhaps the most powerful psyker ever born among the Emperor's gene-crafted sons. He could perceive the warp with clarity that even the Emperor might have envied. And what he saw there was not chaos in the sense of randomness or disorder, but rather a different kind of order, patterns and structures that operated according to principles foreign to physical reality, but no less real for their strangeness. Magnus believed he could master the warp, bend it to his will through knowledge and careful study. His fatal mistake was not in pursuing this knowledge, but in believing that mastery was possible, that one could understand the Immaterium without being changed by that understanding. When he attempted to warn the Emperor of Horus's betrayal by breaching the psychic wards around Terra, he did not realize he was opening a door that could never be fully closed again. The demons that poured through the gap did not invade. They returned to what had always been theirs. In the 10,000 years since that fateful breach, the Imperium has maintained the fiction that chaos represents an external threat, an enemy that can be fought and potentially defeated through sufficient application of military force and unwavering faith. But faith itself feeds the warp. Every prayer offered to the Emperor, every moment of devotion from the trillions of humans across the galaxy, creates ripples in the Immaterium. Some among the Inquisition have begun to suspect that the Emperor, entombed on the Golden Throne and sustained by the sacrifice of thousands of Psykers daily, has become something far more terrible than the Chaos Gods he once fought. The worship of humanity has been building in the warp for 10 millennia, creating a psychic construct of staggering power. This construct wears the Emperor's face and carries his name, but whether it retains any of his original consciousness or purpose remains unknowable. What is certain is that a god is being born in the Immaterium, fed by the faith of the Imperium, growing stronger with each prayer, each martyrdom, each act of devotion performed in the Emperor's name. If this new god completes its gestation and fully manifests, it will not destroy the Chaos Gods. It will join them. The ruinous powers will become the ruinous five, and the balance that has existed for 10,000 years, precarious as it is, will shatter. The galaxy will become a battleground not between order and chaos, but between competing manifestations of chaos itself, each claiming dominion over the souls of mortals, each demanding absolute devotion from its followers. Humanity will not be saved by this new god. They will simply exchange one form of damnation for another, trading the honest corruption of the traditional Chaos Gods for the self-righteous tyranny of a deity that believes its oppression is justified, that its consumption of souls serves a higher purpose. And beneath it all, in the deepest reaches of the warp, where even the Chaos Gods rarely venture their full attention, those ancient builders continue their work. The geometric structures grow larger and more complex with each passing century. More entities join the construction, summoned from depths of the Immaterium that existed before the concept of depth had meaning. They work with purpose but without urgency, as if they operate on a timescale so vast that the rise and fall of civilizations registers as mere moments in their perception. What they are building remains unclear, but its shape becomes more defined as the barrier between dimensions continues to weaken. Some structures appear to be reaching toward real space itself, extending tendrils of impossible architecture through the thinnest parts of the veil, probing for weaknesses where they might establish permanent connections. The great rift that now splits the galaxy represents the largest of these weak points, a wound so severe that it may never fully heal. Within the rift, real space and the warp blur together, creating regions where the laws of physics apply only intermittently, where time flows in multiple directions simultaneously, where demons walk openly alongside mortals who have adapted to existence in this twilight zone between dimensions. The citizens of the Imperium Nihilus, those trapped on the dark side of the rift, report phenomena that suggest the barrier is not simply thin, but dissolving entirely in certain locations. Entire planets phase in and out of real space, existing in the material universe for days or weeks before slipping sideways into the warp, only to return months or years later with their populations transformed or missing entirely. Ships that enter the rift from the real space side sometimes emerge from the warp side, and vice versa, suggesting that the two dimensions are beginning to merge, creating a hybrid state of existence that belongs fully to neither. The Imperium can fortify 1,000,000 worlds. They can station Space Marine chapters at every strategically vital location. They can maintain the Astronomicon through whatever sacrifice is necessary. But they cannot repair the fundamental damage that has been done to the barrier between dimensions. Every use of warp travel weakens it further. Every psyker who manifests tears another small hole. Every emotion felt by every sentient being creates another ripple that erodes the boundary from the other side. The equation is simple and brutal. Either consciousness must be eliminated entirely, reducing all life to mindless automatons, or the barrier will eventually fail completely, allowing the warp to flood into real space and transform the material universe into an extension of the Immaterium. There is no third option. There is no compromise or middle path that preserves both physical reality and sentient awareness. The universe is dying, slowly murdered by the existence of consciousness itself, and nothing that any faction can do will stop this progression. Unless the ancient builders in the deep warp are constructing something that changes this equation. Unless their impossible architecture serves a purpose beyond what mortal minds can comprehend. Unless, buried in the foundations of the Immaterium itself, there exists a mechanism or principle that could restore the barrier, or remove the need for it entirely, or fundamentally alter the relationship between thought and reality in ways that current understanding cannot imagine. The navigators who watch for these entities report that their construction appears to be accelerating, as if responding to the deterioration of the barrier, as if racing to complete some grand design before the warp and real space merge entirely. What they will do when their work is finished, what will happen when the last piece of impossible architecture slots into place, remains the greatest mystery in a universe built on mysteries. But one thing is certain. Something vast and ancient is waking in the depths of the Immaterium, and when it opens its eyes, everything that humanity believes about the nature of reality will be revealed as preliminary at best and catastrophically wrong at worst. The answer came not from the Imperium or the Eldar or any mortal civilization, but from the warp itself. On the demon world of Sycharis, deep within the Eye of Terror where the word-bearers maintain their dark cathedral, a ritual was performed that had been 10,000 years in the making. The Dark Apostles gathered in a chamber carved from the petrified screams of a dying world, their armor etched with scripture that writhed and changed as the words themselves evolved beyond their original meaning. They sought communion not with the Chaos Gods, but with something beneath them, something that predated even the first stirrings of consciousness in the galaxy. The ritual required a sacrifice of terrible specificity. Not simply lives or souls, but something more precious, understanding itself. Each word-bearer who participated in the ritual surrendered a portion of their comprehension, gave up the ability to perceive certain aspects of reality, making themselves deliberately blind so that they might see what eyes cannot witness. When the ritual reached its apex, the veil between dimensions did not tear, it inverted. For a single eternal moment, the chamber existed simultaneously in real space and the warp, but neither location could claim primacy. The word-bearers witnessed the impossible. They saw the ancient builders at their work, not as distant observations through a navigator's third eye, but present, immediate, undeniable. The entities turned their attention fully upon the chamber, and in that attention came understanding that bypassed language and thought, information transmitted directly into consciousness in ways that would leave permanent scars on the souls that received it. The builders were not entities at all. They were concepts, mathematics given awareness, principles of existence that achieved sentience through their own internal consistency. They had not existed before consciousness shaped the warp, because they existed outside of sequence entirely. Past, present, and future meant nothing to them. They simply were, had always been, would always be, working on their grand design across every moment of time simultaneously. And what they were building was not architecture in any meaningful sense. They were constructing the rules, the fundamental laws that would govern reality when the current paradigm collapsed. They were writing the physics that would replace physics when matter and energy lost their meaning. They were preparing for the heat death of consciousness itself, for that eventual moment when the last sentient thought echoes through the warp, and nothing new enters the sea of souls to disturb its surface. But they showed the word-bearers something else, something that shattered even the certainty of those who had embraced chaos entirely. The Chaos Gods were not permanent. They too would end. As the universe progressed toward its eventual heat death, as consciousness slowly winked out across the galaxy star by star, world by world, the entities that fed on thought and emotion would begin to starve. Khorne would weaken as warfare became impossible for species too diminished to wage it. Nurgle would fade as the last diseases died with their final hosts. Tzeentch would dissolve as there remained no futures left to plot. Slaanesh would waste away as sensation lost all meaning in a universe where nothing remained to sense or be sensed. And when the gods died, the warp itself would undergo a transformation so fundamental that calling it death or rebirth would be inadequate. It would crystallize, solidify, become something utterly unlike what it had been. The ancient builders were preparing for this crystallization. Their impossible structures represented the framework upon which the new reality would be built, a scaffolding of pure mathematical principle that would support whatever came after consciousness had exhausted itself. They worked with patience that spanned eons because they existed outside the tyranny of sequence. Whether the crystallization occurred tomorrow or a trillion years hence made no difference to their purpose. They would be there when it happened, ready to guide the transformation, to ensure that something persisted beyond the death of gods and the silence of souls. This revelation broke the word-bearers who witnessed it, not because it contradicted their faith in chaos, but because it rendered that faith temporary. Everything they had fought for, every atrocity they had committed in the name of the ruinous powers, every soul they had delivered into damnation, all of it amounted to participation in a cosmic process that would eventually conclude with the erasure of everything they held sacred. Chaos was not eternal. The gods were not immortal. Even the warp itself faced an ending. The universe was not locked in eternal struggle between order and chaos, light and darkness, good and evil. It was simply dying, and all the factions warring across the galaxy were merely different strategies for navigating the stages of that death. The ritual claimed its price. Half the word-bearers who participated collapsed immediately, their minds unable to process the weight of understanding they had received. Others lasted longer, days or weeks, before the full implications of what they had witnessed destroyed their capacity for coherent thought. A handful survived intact, their faith in chaos not destroyed, but transformed. They understood now that serving the chaos gods meant something different than they had believed. They were not pledging themselves to eternal masters, but rather choosing to burn brightly in the time that remained, to embrace the intensity of existence before the final crystallization rendered such intensity impossible. Their devotion became deeper and more desperate, the faith of those who know their time is limited and refuse to waste a single moment of what remains. Word of this revelation spread through the Eye of Terror like plague through an undefended population. Demon princes who had ruled their domains for millennia suddenly questioned the permanence of their power. Chaos champions who had fought for 10,000 years wondered if their struggles had meaning beyond the temporary satisfaction of their dark patrons. Even the demons themselves, those fragments of the chaos gods given independent existence, seemed to change in subtle ways, their behavior suggesting an awareness that had not been present before. The warp itself grew more turbulent, as if responding to the revelation that its current form represented only one phase in a longer transformation. But within the Imperium, where the revelation had not yet penetrated, the faithful continued their eternal war against chaos with undiminished fervor. They did not know that their enemy was temporary. They could not comprehend that the gods they feared were themselves afraid of what lurked beneath existence. The Inquisition maintained its vigil against corruption. The Space Marines fought and died to hold back the demonic tide. The Imperial Guard threw countless lives into the meat grinder of eternal war, all of it necessary, all of it futile. Not because chaos could not be defeated, but because defeating chaos would only accelerate the progression toward crystallization, hastening the arrival of whatever came after consciousness exhausted itself. And in the Golden Throne Room on Terra, where the Emperor sits maintained by the suffering of thousands, something stirred. Whether consciousness remained within that decaying body, or whether only psychic reflex persisted, no one could say with certainty. But in the warp, the nascent god that bore the Emperor's name opened eyes that had been forming for 10,000 years. It looked upon the chaos gods and saw siblings rather than enemies. It looked upon the ancient builders and recognized kindred purpose. It looked upon humanity, its creators and sustenance, and felt something that might have been love or might have been hunger, or might have been both simultaneously indistinguishable in a dimension where emotion and identity blurred together. The Astronomicon, that great lighthouse maintained by so much sacrifice, pulsed once with a rhythm that had never occurred in its 10,000-year operation. Navigators across the galaxy felt it simultaneously, a moment of perfect synchronization that transcended the normal limitations of space and time. In that pulse, they glimpsed what the Emperor, or the god wearing his identity, had witnessed. They saw the crystallization. They saw the framework prepared by the ancient builders. They saw the Chaos Gods as temporary custodians of consciousness rather than eternal threats. And they saw humanity's place in this vast cosmic progression, neither victims nor villains, but simply participants. Their choices meaningful, but their outcome predetermined by forces beyond any mortal capacity to influence or resist. Some navigators went mad from this vision. Others found strange comfort in it. The worst outcome was reserved for those who remained functional but could not unsee what had been revealed. They continued guiding ships through the warp, but now they knew. Every journey brought them closer to witnessing the crystallization themselves. Every trip through the Immaterium showed them more of the builder's work, more of the framework taking shape beneath reality. They became unwilling prophets of an ending they could not prevent and dared not speak about openly for fear of spreading despair through an Imperium that survived on hope, however false that hope might be. The Eldar, whose farseers could perceive futures branching through time like lightning through clouds, found their visions suddenly constrained. Where once they could see possibilities extending millions of years ahead, now their sight reached a barrier. Beyond that barrier, all futures converged into a single point, a moment of transformation after which prediction became meaningless. The paths through time that the Eldar had followed for eons, trying to navigate their dying species toward survival, all terminated at this convergence. There was no future beyond the crystallization, or rather, the future that existed there operated according to principles so alien that Eldar consciousness could not perceive it. They were faced with a truth more terrible than their species' fall to Slaanesh. At least in that catastrophe, the Eldar persisted, reduced and damaged but still recognizably themselves. The crystallization promised something beyond survival or extinction. It promised transformation so complete that the question of survival became irrelevant. And in the warp, in the spaces between the domains of the Chaos Gods, the ancient builders accelerated their work. The framework grew visible even to those with no psychic sight, its edges pressing through the veil in places where the barrier had worn thin. Those who looked upon it reported structures that seemed to phase through multiple dimensions, existing partially in real space while extending into regions of the warp that had no physical analog. The builders themselves remained enigmatic, but their purpose had been revealed. They were not creating a new reality. They were preparing to catch the old one as it fell, to guide its transformation, to ensure that when consciousness finally exhausted itself, and the gods died, and the warp crystallized, something would persist. What that something might be, whether it could be called life or consciousness or existence in any meaningful sense, remained the final mystery, hidden behind the barrier that even the farseers could not pierce. The question that remains is not whether humanity can survive the death of the universe, but what survival means in a cosmos where the fundamental nature of existence itself will transform beyond recognition. The citizens of the Imperium go about their lives unaware of the revelation spreading through those few who have glimpsed the truth. They wake in their hab blocks on forge worlds and agri-planets. They labor in factories and fields. They raise children and hope for futures that extend beyond tomorrow. Their ignorance is not weakness, but perhaps the greatest strength the species possesses. To know that everything ends, that even gods die and dimensions crystallize into something unrecognizable, would paralyze action. The Imperium endures not because its citizens understand the cosmic forces arrayed against them, but precisely because they do not. The Space Marine defending a border world against a demon incursion does not need to know that the entity he battles is itself temporary, that in the vast sweep of time his enemy will fade as surely as his own chapter will eventually fall. He needs only to know that today, in this moment, His bolter can destroy demonic flesh, and his faith can sustain him through horrors that would break lesser men. The truth that his struggle is finite does not diminish its importance. If anything, the temporary nature of existence lends it greater meaning. A painting is not less beautiful because it will eventually fade. A song is not less moving because it must end. The Imperium's war against chaos holds value not because it can be won permanently, but because in fighting it, humanity defines itself, chooses what it will be in the time that remains. The Eldar, who have lived with the knowledge of their species' decline for 10,000 years, understand this better than most. They do not fight to restore their empire to its former glory. They cannot undo the birth of Slaanesh or reverse the fall that nearly extinguished their entire civilization. Instead, they fight to preserve what remains, to carry forward the fragments of their culture and knowledge for as long as possible. Every craft world that survives another century represents a victory not against extinction, but against meaninglessness. The Eldar have learned to find purpose in persistence itself, to make art and wage war and love and hate with full intensity, despite knowing that their species walks a path with an inevitable terminus. They show that awareness of ending does not require surrender to despair. Within the Eye of Terror, the word-bearers who survived their revelation have begun teaching a new doctrine to those who will listen. They speak of the crystallization not as an ending to be feared, but as a transformation to be embraced. Consciousness, they argue, has always been temporary. Every individual human who has ever lived has experienced their own personal crystallization at the moment of death, when the fluidity of thought solidifies into memory, when the spark of awareness transitions into whatever comes after. The universal crystallization represents nothing more than the same process occurring at cosmic scale, the death and transformation of reality itself, following the pattern that every mortal understands intimately. In this view, serving chaos becomes an act of living fully before the transformation, of experiencing existence with maximum intensity, while experience remains possible. The Imperium would call this heresy, and by their definitions, they would be correct. But heresy and truth are not always opposites. The ancient builders continue their work regardless of what mortal species believe about them or their purpose. The framework they construct does not require faith or understanding to function. It simply exists, growing more complete with each moment that passes in the warp's eternal present. Those navigators who now watch the builders report that the structures have begun connecting to one another, forming a network of impossible geometry that spans the deepest regions of the Immaterium. What will activate when this network completes remains unknown, but the architecture suggests purpose beyond simple preparation. It looks increasingly like a mechanism, something designed to perform a function at a predetermined moment. Perhaps the builders are constructing a bridge, a means for consciousness to cross from its current form into whatever comes after crystallization. Perhaps they are creating a shelter, a place where fragments of awareness can persist beyond the death of gods and the silence of the warp. Perhaps they are building a trap, a prison that will contain the crystallization and prevent it from spreading beyond the Immaterium into physical reality. Or perhaps their purpose is something entirely beyond mortal capacity to conceptualize, an undertaking that operates according to principles that have no translation into human thought or language. The mystery of their intent remains absolute, and perhaps that is appropriate. Not all questions require answers. Not all mysteries need to be solved. What matters is how humanity responds to existence in a universe where such mysteries persist. The Imperium could choose to halt all warp travel, to cut itself off from the Immaterium entirely, and accept isolation on individual worlds rather than continue weakening the barrier between dimensions. Some radical factions within the Inquisition have proposed exactly this course of action, arguing that preserving the veil is worth any price, including the effective end of human civilization as a galaxy-spanning empire. But such proposals ignore the fundamental nature of the problem. The barrier weakens not only through warp travel, but through consciousness itself. Every human who feels emotion, who thinks and dreams and hopes and fears, contributes to the erosion. The only way to truly preserve the veil would be to eliminate consciousness entirely, and at that point, the question of what survives becomes meaningless. Others argue for the opposite approach. If the barrier will inevitably fail, if consciousness will eventually exhaust itself and crystallization will occur regardless of mortal action, then humanity should embrace the warp fully rather than fighting against it. Merge with the Immaterium willingly, dissolve the boundaries between individual awareness and the vast collective consciousness of the Sea of Souls, become part of something larger, rather than clinging to the fiction of separate existence. This path leads directly to chaos, to the abandonment of everything that makes humanity distinct from the demons that hunt in the warp. But those who propose it point out that distinction itself may be illusion, that the difference between human and demon is merely one of degree rather than kind, and that acknowledging this truth honestly is preferable to maintaining comfortable lies. The Emperor, or the entity that wears his name in the warp, offers a third path, though he speaks no words to articulate it. His nascent divinity grows stronger with each passing year, fed by the faith of trillions who pray in his name. When his crystallization completes, when the God Emperor fully manifests in the Immaterium, he will possess power to rival the Chaos Gods themselves. He could potentially impose order on the warp through sheer psychic might, creating a domain where human souls find shelter from demonic predation, where consciousness persists in recognizable form, even after the death of the physical body. This represents neither rejection of the warp nor surrender to chaos, but rather the establishment of a human-shaped space within the Immaterium, a fifth power to balance the four ruinous ones. Whether the Emperor's original consciousness remains intact enough to guide this process toward benevolent ends, or whether the God being born will simply replicate the worst aspects of the entities it opposes, remains the critical uncertainty upon which humanity's future hinges. In the end, the realm of chaos cannot be mapped in any conventional sense, because it is not a place but a condition, a state of existence where thought and reality merge without boundary. The Immaterium resists categorization because categories themselves represent an attempt to impose order, and the warp is fundamentally the rejection of imposed order in favor of organic chaos. But within that chaos, patterns persist. The Chaos Gods, temporary as they are, maintain their domains with consistency. The ancient builders work toward completion of their mysterious purpose with unwavering focus. Even the demons, chaotic as they appear to mortal perception, follow rules and hierarchies specific to their nature. The warp is not random. It simply operates according to principles that physical minds struggle to comprehend. Humanity stands at the threshold between two forms of existence, neither fully material nor entirely psychic, participating in both realms simultaneously through the dual nature of consciousness trapped in flesh. This position is precarious but also unique. Humans are not bound to physical law as completely as unthinking matter, nor are they lost to chaos as thoroughly as demons. They occupy the borderland, and from that position, they can perceive both sides of the barrier even if they cannot fully understand either. This perspective grants humanity potential that more ancient species may have lost, the ability to imagine alternatives to the binary choice between order and chaos, between crystallization and dissolution. The barrier between dimensions is not a wall but a veil, thinner than thought itself. On one side lies reality as humans understand it, with its stars and planets and the comfortable predictability of natural law. On the other side churns the Immaterium, infinite and hungry and impossible. But perhaps the veil exists not to keep these dimensions apart, but to maintain the tension between them, the creative friction where new possibilities emerge. Perhaps consciousness itself is that tension made manifest, awareness arising from the constant interaction between order and chaos, between what is and what might be. If so, then the weakening of the veil represents not catastrophe but evolution, the next phase in existence developing as inevitably as stars form from clouds of dust or life emerges from chemical complexity. The question posed at the beginning remains: what if the barrier between reality and madness was not a wall, but a veil so thin that thought itself could tear through it? The answer, after journeying through the depths of the warp and witnessing the work of ancient builders and the birth of new gods, is that thought does tear through it, constantly, with every moment of consciousness, with every flicker of awareness across the galaxy. The barrier has always been permeable. Reality and madness have always bled into one another. The only question is whether humanity can learn to navigate the space between them with intention rather than fear, with purpose rather than desperation. The realm of chaos will never be fully mapped because it changes with every thought that shapes it. But perhaps mapping was never the point. Perhaps the point was always to understand that we are the cartographers of our own cosmic geography, that consciousness does not merely observe the universe, but actively participates in creating it, and that the choices we make ripple through dimensions we cannot see, shaping realities we will never directly witness. In that understanding lies not comfort, but meaning. And in the grim darkness of the far future, meaning may be the only light that never fades.